Everything has come down to this. The last few weeks of your life have been dedicated to perfecting your craft, mastering your combos, and studying those of your enemies, watching their every move and learning their tells, the way their arms hitch at the shoulder before a vicious uppercut send you plummeting to the spikes several feet below the narrow slab of rock you're engaged on, and watching the way your enemy's knees buckle before a devastating energy blast completely eviscerates your flesh. And now you have put it all on the line for that one shot of eternal glory. Your nerves are strained, sweat leaking from your furrowed brow to sting the corner of your eyes, only you can't wipe it away. To do so would be to forfeit your concentration. Your focus is ironclad, your eyes wide and unblinking as you watch the screen before you pulsate and flash, with each command that is given, unbroken by such flashy and stylish effects. The controller in your hands has become a physical extension of your own fingers as you navigate a successful defense before another savage combo tears your avatar apart. A sliver of health, all that stands between you and the destruction of your ruthless enemy. Electricity has built up in the space between you and your opponent over the last half hour as the two of you have thrown everything and more at each other to be the sole champion. And now your opponent has his back to the wall, resorting to cheap tricks and dirty tactics that have kept you floored, unable to strike back with effective results. The name of the game is survival, and an opportunity presents itself when another vicious attack from your enemy falls short, allowing you to unleash one of your own. Only, it isn't enough. Frayed nerves have crippled your ability to think and to process information, and a single dodge that you have missed is all it takes for your opponent to put you down for good, and the new tournament champion to be crowned. It was video games such as Tekken, Street Fighter, and Mortal Kombat that ultimately popularized gaming competitions such as this, of this particular scale, and it was video games as a whole that will serve as our topic for this lesson. At some point or another, as you have crept through the sinister looping dungeons of Quake and Doom, or as you merrily bounced upon boxes and spun enemies out of your screen in Crash Bandicoot, or as you totally dominated an entire outpost in Far Cry, we might have come to pause a moment and wonder how it was that we all got to this particular point in the history of our video games. Perhaps you've never cared at all. Why would you sit and dwell on a distorted past in which engaging gameplay consisted of sliding a laser base across the screen from side to side? Why the hell would you have any fond memories at all of games consisting of black and white graphics that appeared to be crafted out of Duplo blocks? Why would you have ever sat and reminisced about heating up a soldering iron to build your very own first home computer from a simple kit of circuit boards and old-ass Stone Age microprocessors? What is it about those good old days that made them so good at all, as we are prone to claim that they have been, especially when, should you have had the desire to listen along to some good tunes for your TV game entertainment, it meant that you had to physically get off your ass and put a cassette of Madonna or Bon Jovi inside the deck of your stereo. Nah, you see, it is better to just go and have ourselves another game of Assassin's Creed or Call of Duty. But allow me to ask you all this. Would Ridge Racer, or Gran Turismo, or Forza, or any driving game at all ever have come into existence if Atari had never conjured up the design for pole position? And let me ask, who would be out there designing these games now if Apple's Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs, or even the great Sir Clive Sinclair, hadn't first developed computers that were cheap enough to enthusiastic amateurs of entertainment, who would then go on to teach themselves to program and are most likely now running major software development companies? And let me ask just who the hell it would even be out there playing these games today if people like Atari's Nolan Bushnell hadn't initially kicked off the entire goddamn gaming industry in the first place. Or if people like the legendary Shigeru Miyamoto hadn't made video games an integral component of popular culture, and who, might I add, would have been constantly pushing all this new age technology to its absolute limits if people that look, talk, walk, eat, and dress exactly like you had never spent the last 45 years inserting coins into narrow slots and cashing in tills while demanding for bigger and better games for your hard-earned money. You probably didn't even realize this at all, but anybody out there that has ever held a controller in their hands, designed a character in a role-playing game, or even created an entire level in online sandboxes, or even turned on a gaming console at all, can all be inextricably linked within the entire history of video games. And with this being the case, it is now my seldom duty to fill in those gaps in your education by welcoming you all aboard on another wild trip through time. I am your enigmatic and unfiltered host, Samantha Rose, and gamer or not, I strongly implore all of you to come and witness the rise of video games. Let's go! The ever-growing roots, with enough time and patience, of the gaming industry can be traced all the way back to 1962, when a man named Steve Russell, who was a student at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology with a mean affinity for science fiction, created a game he called Space War. This was an incredibly simple game in design that pitted two line-drawn spacecraft against one another in head-to-head combat. However, in these aged times of valves and vacuum tubes, this was a highly advanced piece of electronic programming that took the available technology of the time to new heights that were previously unknown. The only computers back then that were powerful enough to pull this off were room-sized machines that were attended to by beardy men in long white coats down at the local university's computer lab. But by the end of the 60s, Space War was making it big time as an extracurricular activity that was happily shared by America's bright, young, enthusiastic students of science. And among these students was a dude named Nolan Bushnell, who, very shortly after graduating from the University of Utah, decided he was going to build his very own version of the campus popular Space War that he named Computer Space, which, unlike its original design, his version did not require an entire whole-ass mainframe computer to play it. Bushnell used the electronic skills he'd established and craftily put together just enough computer hardware to play the game. He then hooked this hardware into a 19-inch black and white TV, and the very first arcade game was given birth. Bushnell's game didn't call for the use of a full-blown computer to hide within the box, and so he reckoned that it would be relatively cheap to mass-produce Computer Space in its stead, setting his machines up as coin-operated amusement gizmos in common bars and small arcades. He was to convince an amusement manufacturer to build 1,500 Computer Space machines, but to his dismay and surprise, hardly anyone was even interested in buying these things, and this was honestly probably due in full to nobody knowing just who the hell this dude even was. He did have some potential buyers, however. They were all concerned about these machines being stolen for the television set contained within them. And even the low number of players that actually got their hands on this game were seriously put off by the lengthy instructions and the various option screens that confronted them as soon as they slid their quarter into the slot. Bushnell himself went on to blame the failure of his Computer Space game solely on experience, but he wasn't personally put off. He came to the conclusion that a simpler game would be much more likely to attract customers into a bar, and the absolute simplest game that he could come up with was a digitized version of tennis, in which two players used a bat to bounce a ball backwards and forwards across the screen. If your opponent let the ball slip past his bat, then you were awarded the point. Sound familiar, anybody? It should, because in 1972, the first commercial video game company, which Bushnell named Atari, installed the very first commercial video game, called Pong, inside of Andy Kappa's Tavern in good old Sunnyvale, California, and it was a phenomenal success. It's going to be one hell of a ride with this one, you guys. In light of this success, Atari moved upwards and onwards, acquiring hefty stacks of cash and a devoted and talented staff full of young, enthusiastic employees that were eager to dive into this new booming industry. Among these was a 17-year-old dropout named Steve Jobs that was hired on in 1974 as a technician to work on a video basketball game. A good friend of Jobs, Steve Wozniak, was another highly talented electronics wizard of the times. Wozniak was a huge fan of Atari's games, and Jobs would end up smuggling Wozniak into work during the evenings to let him play the new Grand Track driving machines for free. Wozniak also helped Jobs out whenever he would stumble on technical problems, and he eventually got himself hired on full-time, assisting Jobs with the design of the very first breakout machine. Their shared desire and their joint interest in computers and video games evolved further still until, after working numerous weekends in Jobs' family's garage, the dynamic duo came up with a computer of their very own, naturally so it seems, that they called the Apple I. The Apple I wasn't terribly powerful by any means, but the people that saw this thing all thought it was something quite special, and before they all knew it, Jobs and Wozniak had 50 orders for the first Apple computer. That's crazy. Steve Jobs then very quickly realized that there was some good money to be made here, and Steve Wozniak worked on the technical side of the bold operation. Steve Jobs devoted himself to coming up with a way to make the Apple computers appeal to a wider audience, rather than just the sprockety electronics buffs that would frequent the local computer clubs. He came up with strict specifications, drafted in people to build a reliable power supply as well as a stylish case, and so the Apple II was created, and pretty much the entire personal computer enterprise along with it, I would say. To further grow Apple, Steve Jobs needed an investment, and so he went to his old boss, Nolan Bushnell, and asked if he wanted in on the deal at ground floor. Bushnell declined, however, a decision he probably came to deeply regret soon after, I wager, and instead, Bushnell expressed his own plans for the home market in entertainment, and they were to begin designing a home version of Atari's original arcade smash hit, the immortal Pong. A similar game from a rival company called Magnavox had been selling since 1972, but when Atari went on to release its official home version of Pong in 1974, it had the advantage of being technically superior. After an initially poor response to this, the machine had really taken off by 1975, so much so that several other American electronics conglomerates started to take an interest in this new demand for TV games. And by the end of 1976, there were a solid 20 competitors that were all trying to constantly one-up the other with the introduction of better, technically advanced machines. It took a company called Fairchild Camera to come up with the very first system of interchangeable cartridges. Looking now to regain his throne at the head of the entire gaming industry, the throne he'd initially built with Pong, Nolan Bushnell came up with something so much better. I give you the Atari 2600 VCS with colored graphics, better quality of sound so you can hear every single bit of your game at all times, and the promise of an entire catalog of game cartridges from the people behind the inception of all your favorite arcade bars. The 2600 was incredibly expensive to produce, however, and Atari didn't have the means to mass produce and market the machine on a larger, bolder scale. Bushnell sought investors, winding up at the door of Warner Communications. Warner Communications offered to buy out the entire operation. Bushnell hadn't initially been looking for a complete buyout, not of his kingdom, but he would later go on to admit that he was extremely relieved to see someone out there that wanted to help him out regardless. Bushnell made a fortune on this deal, and Warner also agreed to keep him on as Atari's chairman. However, the relationship soon turned quite sour. and Bushnell found himself arguing consistently with his new Warner bosses regarding several of Atari's core values and founding pillars. One of these particular debates concerned Atari's entrance into the personal computer market, in which Apple was already beginning to dominate the way that only Apple can do. Envious that he had missed his chance to be a creative part of Apple's immediate and rising success, Bushnell wanted the Atari 800 to totally trounce the Apple II. And so he had designed to include spectacular graphics and stellar sound design that would make this device the perfect machine for not only arcade computer games, but personal business. However, unlike Apple, Atari firmly decided that no one else would be allowed to write software for the 800, essentially creating the first exclusive gaming system. Opposite this right, while the Apple II thrived with a large catalog of software, which included several business programs that became highly essential industry-standard packages for years to come, and the Atari 800 was left in a trail of dust. On the note of this strict policy, Bushnell insisted that Warner allowed him to tweak it, and he also demanded that Warner cut the price of the 2600 and to rely on the increased income that would result from sales of more cartridges in place of this price cut. Warner did not agree with this at all, and Bushnell, the one man solely responsible for the entire video games industry, was ultimately compelled to leave Atari behind. Despite his unfortunate abandonment of his throne, the industry itself was totally thriving. Atari had established a strong and incredibly varied catalog of cartridge games for the 2600, and it was very suddenly declared the name in coin-operated video games with titles such as Asteroids, which was an explosive twist on the whole computer space concept, and Missile Commander, which turned the popular paranoia of the time about the imminent nuclear destruction of the entire world into a highly addictive and challenging shoot-'em-up. Which, I mean, Atari does have some seriously kick-ass games, but as far as their consoles go, straight ass, which is really disappointing given their arcade popularity. You think they would be better at it. Other amusement companies that had been producing pinball machines and jukeboxes of all things joined Atari in the height of the arcade boom. Taito's legendary Space Invaders landed in 1978 and started the first major arcade craze with its totally simple but incredibly hypnotic shoot-'em-up action. This was followed closely by Namco's similar but much more sophisticated Galaxians, which had amazing colored graphics and much more aggressive aliens to contend with that would make devastating kamikaze runs at the player instead of just floating along the top of the screen to blast lazy pot shots straight down at the player. Further heightening the sophistication of video games was Williams' Defender, a game created by Eugene Jarvis. Several important firsts in the history of gaming can be attributed to this one game. Jarvis had given the player a mission that needed to be completed rather than to just simply defend themselves against swarms of aliens. This mission was to prevent a certain quota of wandering spacemen from being captured by aliens. Also, it wasn't only the aliens that moved in this game. For the very first time in electronic gaming, the entire fucking screen moved, scrolling from left to right at extremely high velocity in order to follow the action as the player also moved, flying their tiny needle-nosed spaceship across the game's mountainous landscape. And have any of you ever actually played Defender? This game is fucking hard. Anyways, unlike most other games that only had one, maybe two different types of enemies to destroy, Defender came loaded with an entire cast of adversaries. Some of these were the usual simple garbage-ass cannon fodder, or even split into swarms of smaller, faster craft when they were shot at. Defender essentially being the first game to troll its own players, perhaps. And Defender was the first game to give the player bonus weapons to compensate for the overinflated aggression of the enemies, such as smart bombs that would seek and destroy an entire screen full of baddies in a single colorful flash, and these could be awarded and even stacked for scoring specific target goals while you played. I mean, goddamn, guys, Defender was a true milestone for gaming as a whole. Shifting across the vast blue ocean to the United Kingdom, home video games were behind in their design compared to America. However, they weren't too far behind, mind you. Atari's Pong machines and their many cheaper lookalikes from the Far East had been around at this point since the mid-70s, becoming popular in a more faddish sort of way. And by 1979, the school kids who were already in on the whole gaming scene from their time spent at arcades were dreaming about owning the Atari 2600 VCS. And this was all before the consumer electronics boom had even come to their shore, and most parents of the time didn't even want to consider spending £100 on a toy that would only steal time away from their favorite TV programs. The very idea of buying and owning any sort of home computer at all was complete nonsense to these guys. The Apple II and the Atari 800 were being imported, along with Commodore's all-in-one PET system and the Tandy TRS-80. That sounds like a Terminator name. But these were all only available from specialist retailers or mail-order firms. As for most of the British consumers all knew, computers were meant specifically for offices and universities, and these people were simply not going to pay good money to own one in their own home. The Atari 800 retailed for around £650, which was the equivalent of a newly fitted kitchen for most. However, there was still a small market for computers in the UK, mainly consisting of electronic buffs wanting to experiment further with newer technologies. Computers were made available in kit form for around £200, though in stark comparison to their American counterparts, these machines were pretty basic, consisting of a motherboard without a case and sometimes lacked even a keyboard. Not surprisingly, to follow this, the games for these machines were almost completely non-existent. It was in 1980 that major change was imminent when an English inventor named Clive Sinclair decided to release an extremely low-cost, all-in-one computer kit which was simple to assemble and could even be programmed in an incredibly easy-to-learn computer language called BASIC, which stands for Beginner's All-Purpose Symbolic Instruction Code. Once assembled, the 100-pound Sinclair ZX80 kit was a small, white, flat machine with a touch-sensitive keyboard, an 8-bit Z80 processor, and a minuscule 1 kilobyte of random access memory, or RAM, that one could play around with. But before you all get too excited about these specs, the ZX80, despite being easily assembled, was not an easy thing to actually play. See, the ZX80 didn't quite have enough computing power to process instructions while keeping the display going at the same time. So when a program was running and active, the screen would go totally blank until it had finished. This machine wasn't at all ideal for a rip-roaring conversion of, say, Space Invaders. This thing also had a high tendency to overheat and break down a lot. So much so that some of its consumers would stand a bottle of cold milk on the case to keep it cool enough to use it all. That's funny. While the ZX80 wasn't all that popular, nor all that much of a gaming system, it did spur on a new batch of semi-techie folk into the ways of the microcomputer. And by establishing a market for low-cost home computers, it greatly paved the way for the machines that were to follow. And that, gals and guys, is where we will stop part 1. This is going to be a continuing series. I don't know how many for sure, but there is a lot of information about video game history that I find absolutely fascinating, and I want to share it all with you. So, stay tuned for part 2, Retro Rage, coming soon, and I will see you guys next time on Twisted